Tonight, the first of an occasional series that we're calling Amazing Lives, and King Simeon of Bulgaria is surely living one. Once one of Europe's youngest royals, who became the wartime king of his country at just 6 years old, was toppled before his 10th birthday, and 50 years later returned home as the elected prime minister. But in a way, this is also the story of his father, King Boris III, whose pivotal decision against Hitler during World War II saved tens of thousands of Jews, many more than even Oskar Schindler saved. But it's a story with a twist. As World War II broke out, King Boris, who's described as a Democrat at heart, wanted to stay neutral, but he aligned with Hitler's Third Reich, reportedly to win back territories the Nazis had occupied. But in 1943, more than 11,000 Jews in those territories were deported to concentration camps. Later that same year, Boris refused Hitler's orders to deport more than 48,000 Jews from Bulgaria itself. The little-known story of how King Boris defied Adolf Hitler, then died suddenly, is next. To this day, no one knows what killed him, including his son Simeon, who was catapulted onto the throne at 6. Bulgaria's Orthodox Church played a huge role, and he told me his amazing story at the Orthodox Cathedral here in London. King Simeon, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Anne.
Do you remember the day you became king? You were only 6 years old. Do you remember that moment?
Well, in the eyes of a 6-year-old child, because I would be pretentious to say that I exactly felt and remembered, but what shocked me, A, realizing, of course, that my father had died, but because people referred to me as they referred to him. So that's what, to me, meant that I had succeeded him.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they would call me Your Majesty rather than Your Royal Highness. And that's where I realized that my father was no longer.
And it did come at the end of a long battle that your father waged between joining the Axis powers at the beginning of World War II and in the end saving Bulgaria's Jews against Hitler's wishes, against the wishes of the Nazis, from being deported. According to Jewish tradition, whoever saves one life, it's as if he saved the entire world. And they call such people, particularly those who save Jews, righteous. Do you believe King Boris, your father, was one of the righteous?
Ma'am, I'm nobody to judge my own father, but from the acts and what happened, I think other people should consider it as such, because after all, the fact that he avoided that Bulgaria would be occupied by the Nazis and towards the end managed to, precisely because of this, save Bulgaria from a Soviet occupation. So this was already one very important factor. And the second important factor is that nobody had grudges against our Jewish population. I mean, in Bulgaria, the people certainly didn't mind. The church has always been very open and supportive. The different political parties, the same thing, with the exception of some hotheads. So with all this, it was normal that the whole country was against the deportation.
Let me read you something that the German ambassador at the time was quoted as saying and reporting back to Berlin, presumably, in retrospect, that Bulgarians, quote, lacked the ideological enlightenment that we have, referring to the Nazis, and that they do not see in the Jews any flaws justifying taking special measures against them. He seemed to be amazed that Bulgarian people were not anti-Semites, were not like the Nazis.
No, definitely. And Minister Beckerle was very upset with this kind of attitude or approach on behalf of our people. They came from Spain, the Sephardic Jews, basically. They were totally integrated and actually a very, very good element within the country. So there was no reason at all to go suddenly against your neighbor or some chap you know, and suddenly happens that he's Jewish by faith. So I think that there the Nazis underestimated or overestimated, whichever way you wanted to see it.
And yet it was incredibly complex. Boris III, your father, was a sort of Oskar Schindler, but came to it in a very roundabout way. Having joined the Axis, he was going to get back Macedonia and Thrace. And the Nazis demanded that the Jews of Macedonia and Thrace be deported. There were 11,500 of them, 11,400 or so.
Yes.
And they were deported under your father's reign. And they were all sent to the camps in Poland. How do you explain that part of it?
Well, again, we must take things within the context. Those parts or areas or districts were not under the full administration from Sofia, from Bulgaria. The last word the Germans had.
After Thrace and Macedonia, the Metropolitan Stefan actually wrote to your father, and he said, "The cries and the tears of the slighted Bulgarian citizens of Jewish origin are a lawful protest against the injustice done to them. It should be heard and complied with by the king of the Bulgarians." So the church played a huge role in toughening King Boris's spine.
Yes, or at least in showing that nobody really had any grudge. I think we should be quite proud to feel very different, and wherever I travel, wherever I see people of Jewish origin or others too who come and say, well, good for you Bulgarians, and I'm very proud of that.
A year or so later, your father actually did decide, and people call it a triumph, that some of his actions, which prevented the deportation of some 48,000 Bulgarian Jews.
Oh no, those were not touched.
Exactly, and he prevented it in collaboration with the Orthodox Church, with the ordinary Bulgarian people, and with members...
And political parties.
Yes, political parties.
Absolutely.
And members of parliament. There was the beginning of a roundup. There were trains and boxcars that
Yes.
were ready to take Bulgaria's Jews to camps. Your father finally was prevailed upon to try to bluff the Nazis. Talked about the road gangs, the road crews, the construction gangs. Explain that to me.
Well, my father, probably with advice or together with other people, found the solution or the idea of saying that we needed everybody's effort for the war. And that was a very clever trick to bluff, and even maybe the Nazis had hoped that it would be a type of concentration camps or what have you, but it wasn't really that. But in very dire and very difficult circumstances, because being an Axis country, fairly small and strategically so important, the Germans could have done anything had they just noticed anything which went against their wishes.
What role did your mother play?
My mother, she was very discreet and very quiet, and had always been told that, quote unquote, and 100 years ago, that women do not meddle in politics, but she herself, being a very believing religious person, did everything possible to secure passports or to beg for different documents for some of our Jewish families to be able to leave the country.
And she had a very strong point of view on the issue of Jews.
Yes, on the Christian side, that it was monstrous to persecute people for whatever reason, let alone the fact that they were of another faith. And to this day, I must say that I hardly ever dare ask somebody what his religion or her religion is, because I think it's something very personal.
We read that ordinary citizens, farmers, threatened to use their bodies to block any trains if the Nazis insisted on deportations.
The Archbishop of Plovdiv, a town in the south, he threatened to sort of lie across the rails of the track to stop any deportation, other people from different places.
When you were a very little boy, your father faced an agonizing choice. Because of his alignment, he did accede. He did allow 11,400 Jews to be deported and presumably exterminated from territories that had been occupied. Do you think that horror accounted for how he turned around when it came to disobeying the Nazi rules and the Nazi orders to deport Bulgarian Jews?
The territorial was not tied directly to deportation of said people. It did not depend on my father, so he did not allow or forbid or anything those Jews who were outside of Bulgaria proper. So there's no responsibility or blame.
Who was responsible for that?
With the Nazi administration. They were the ones who had the superior command. That anybody can find if wants to be objective and reads facts and doesn't go into all kinds of other malicious explanations.
But nonetheless, the church leaders did complain very, very bitterly about that to the king of Bulgaria, your father. Very, very bitterly. They signed petitions. They said this mustn't happen.
Yes.
And they were amongst those who forced a different reality for Bulgaria itself.
Indeed. But you also must think that the person who is finally responsible, no matter what his feelings are, is the chief of state. So
your
sometimes
father.
It's much more difficult. But you see, it's always we have to keep things within the context and come to facts and say, did the Bulgarians of Jewish faith survive? Yes or no? They did. That's it. And thank God for it. Thank everybody. And let's be happy about it and proud as Bulgarians. But if we start digging and looking around and trying to find something somewhere, anybody can find anything, because nobody is perfect.
Indeed, Bulgaria was the only Axis country whose Jewish population did survive. And after a break on This Amazing Lives, a royal welcome home after 50 years, but this time on the road to elected office. Prime Minister Simeon next, and still grappling with a painful mystery. Was his father's death an accident?
His agony that week seems to be, there was something more than just a heart attack.